Hello everyone, I'm Darcy Bono, and in this video we're going to look at painting a very simple tiger stripe camo. I'm frequently asked by painters, how do I paint camo? I have no idea even where to start. It looks really complicated, and I'm here to let you know that this is actually one of the most easy techniques you could possibly do in painting a miniature. We're just going to be putting splotches on other splotches and then adding some jagged stripes to it. First things first, have your miniature primed in a light color. The lighter this layer is, the brighter your subsequent colors will be. This one was primed with white scar spray. For our first step, we're just going to be laying down a layer of Gut Rippa Flesh contrast. Even though this is a contrast paint, it is fairly opaque and will give you a nice green finish. And we're actually going to be using this straight from the pot, no contrast medium required. The reason you use contrast medium is to prevent pooling on your model. It helps you push the paint around, smooth it out. But since this is camo, we're not going to be worried about pooling because any splotches will just add to the camo pattern. And once the Gut Rippa Flesh has completely dried, it'll look like this. As you can see, it's quite bright, so we're going to be calming it down, giving it an earthier tone using a Athonian Camo shade. And once again, we are going to be using this straight from the pot, no need to thin it. Just slap it on your green surface to darken it a little bit. Do be careful that it doesn't sink a little bit too much into those recesses. And if you do notice any oversaturation in the folds of your fabric, just rinse your brush, wipe it off, and then use the damp brush to just kind of soak up the excess shade. Once the shade coat is completely dried, it'll look like this, and we can move on to the fun part. We're going to be adding a slightly mottled pattern to this, using rattling grime and a piece of sponge. The way this works is you take your sponge, you dip it into the rattling grime straight out the pot. Try and get a slightly linear pattern to this, like on the edge of your sponge, like that. And what you're going to do is then pat it onto a piece of paper. You don't want this much put on your miniature for this reason. Look at that huge blot. You don't want that. Lightly pat it until you start getting a speckled pattern, like this. That's when you know you can put it on your miniature. So really not much to this, just lightly dab your rattling grime onto your miniature and keep a light touch just to avoid smearing. Okay, I'm gonna freeze it right here just because this next part is kind of flavor to taste. If you like this speckled pattern, you can by all means keep this and even build off it by adding additional colors in that same sponged on fashion. But since we're going to be doing tiger stripe camo, those stripes look a little better over top a more subtle mottled look rather than these stark splotches. So immediately after applying the rattling grime, take a damp brush and lightly pat it to diffuse it. It's going to look a little bit like I'm erasing it here just from the camera, but it actually is making this an overall earthier tone as well as darkening the recesses quite a bit. And since camo is all about layers, you can actually repeat this process. Diffuse the rattling grime, let it dry, and then do it again for an even more mottled look. Next, we're going to move on to making the tiger stripes using Ogren Camo. And there's really not much to this. We're just going to be acting as if this was a base coat, so thin your paints a little bit so they flow nicely but still are fairly opaque. And you're just going to paint a bunch of horizontal irregular lines. I recommend looking at camo patterns from any Google search really and just basing it off that. Just make sure they're nice and wide because we're going to be painting a darker line in the inside of each one. In this final step, we're just going to use Cygor Brown and fill in the inside of these larger lines. Now, you don't really need to worry about, quote, messing up here, because if it goes over this line, it's fine. It's an irregular pattern. So you just want to leave a little border, basically around this dark brown. So, that being said, have fun with this. This is a great way to practice brush control without it actually mattering at all if you go outside the lines. So don't stress, enjoy this. Make the insides of this as wiggly as the outside border and it will look just fine. And just a heads up, you don't need to use Cygor Brown. Any dark brown will work, or even a black will work. I just like this one because it's a deep, rich mahogany and flows very well out of the pot without having to thin it. It acts almost more like an ink, which is great for making these thin lines, but any dark brown will work. So here is the camo fully painted, and as you can see, it doesn't look terribly impressive when the rest of the model is not painted. So here is the completed model, and I kind of tripped at the finish line here. I've already sent this guy to a new home, and I cannot find the picture of his back. So we're going to look at the Kroot leader instead. So apologies for that slight snafu. And this was the final one I painted. As you can see, it looks, I honestly think, better the more irregular your stripes are. In this case, it was almost more of a lightning bolt pattern, but it's totally up to you on what shape you want to make them. If you look online, some of the patterns are much more triangular and wide, some are more thin and spidery like this. Totally up to you as far as how you want your camo to look. But this should give you a pretty solid foundation on how to get started. So I hope you found that helpful, and if you did, please remember to like and subscribe, and if you found it exceptionally useful and would like to support the channel and my work as an artist, you can do that in two different ways. There is the thanks icon that is through YouTube, where it's basically a tip jar to say thank you for this helpful video, or you can visit my Ko-fi page in the description. That also functions as a tip jar. It just also functions as a blog that has extra recipes, color tutorials, etc. So thanks very much again for joining me today, and until we meet again, happy painting, everyone!